Back in 5th grade, we had to do skits, and my friends and I pretended to be parts of an atom. I randomly chose to be a neutron, and at one point this kid in our group, Tony, started making fun of me, saying I was neutral. Low-key, I was introverted and didn't like to disagree with people. Maybe that's why what he said made me so mad. I know it was dumb, but I was just a kid. Anyway, the bell ringing was music to my ears, but as I was walking through the hall, this kid named Richard came up to me. Rich was odd, to say the least. I honestly didn't know that much about him. He asked me if I really was neutral, which made me almost lose my temper. I told him no, very matter-of-factly, but then he asked me if I wanted to be a neutron. That took me completely off guard, and my anger turned to confusion. I asked Rich what he meant, but he just repeated himself. "You want to be a neutron, don't you?" he said, his voice low and oddly flat, like he was reciting something he'd rehearsed. I frowned. No, I don't. Why would I want that? Richard's eyes seemed to glint in the dim hallway light, and he leaned closer. Because neutrons are everywhere, but nobody sees them. They're invisible and powerful. They can pass through anything. Don't you want to be free like that? I took a step back, feeling a chill. Look, I don't know what you're talking about, and I need to go. But then Richard grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so scrawny. Wait, I can show you. Meet me in the old science lab after school, the one in the basement. You'll understand then. At this point, I was completely weirded out. I yanked my arm free, muttering, "Fine, whatever," just to get him to leave me alone. For the record, I didn't plan on actually going. The basement science lab was insanely creepy, an old unused room that everyone said was haunted. Kids claimed they heard whispers or saw shadows moving behind the frosted glass door. I figured Richard was just messing with me, trying to scare me because of the teasing earlier. The rest of the day dragged on, but I couldn't stop thinking about Richard's weird intensity. By the time the final bell rang, curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I'd just peek into the basement, see if he was there, and leave. I wasn't going to let him think I was scared. The basement stairs were cold and damp, the air smelling like mildew and something metallic. The science lab door was ajar, a faint flickering light spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but then I heard Richard's voice, soft and sing-songy. "Come in, I've been waiting." Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open slowly. There he was, standing in the middle of the room. The lab was a mess, dusty shelves lined with broken beakers, old textbooks piled in corners, and a chalkboard covered in faded equations. In the center of the room was a strange device, about the size of a microwave, with wires and dials haphazardly arranged. It hummed faintly, and a soft, bluish glow pulsed from a small glass window on its side. "What is that?" I asked, staying near the door. Richard turned to me, his smile too wide and too stiff. "It's a neutron detector. My dad used to work at a lab, and he brought this home before he disappeared. It picks up neutron radiation, but it's more than that. It can connect you to them." "Connect me to what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To the neutrons," he said, like it was somehow the most obvious thing in the world. "They're all around us, passing through everything, but most people can't feel them. This machine, it lets you become like them." "This is crazy," I said, backing away. "I'm leaving." But before I could turn, Richard flipped a switch on the device. The hum grew louder and the blue glow intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a sudden jolt, like an electric shock, and my vision blurred. The room seemed to ripple, like I was underwater, and then I saw them, tiny shimmering specks darting through the air, through the walls, through me. They were everywhere, glowing faintly, like fireflies made of starlight. "Do you see them?" Richard asked, his voice echoing strangely. "Those are neutrons. They're passing through you right now. Don't you feel it?" I did feel something, a tingling sensation, like static electricity crawling over my skin. My hands started to shake, and when I looked down, they seemed fuzzy, like the edges were dissolving. "What's happening to me?" I gasped. Richard stepped closer, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You're becoming like them, neutral, unseen, and free." I tried to scream, but my voice came out muffled, like I was shouting into a void. The specks of light began to swirl around me faster and faster until they formed a vortex. I felt myself lifting off the ground, weightless, my body stretching and shrinking at the same time. It was like I was being pulled apart atom by atom and reassembled into something else. "Stop it," I managed to yell, but Richard just watched, his smile growing wider. "You wanted this," he said. "You wanted to be neutral." I clawed at the air, desperate to ground myself. My hand brushed against the device, then I slammed my fist down on the switch. The hum stopped abruptly and the blue glow vanished. I collapsed to the floor, gasping, my body solid again. The specks of light were gone, but the room felt different, too quiet and too heavy. Richard stared at me, his smile fading. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice cold. "Now they'll be angry." "Who?" I demanded, scrambling to my feet. "What are you talking about?" But Richard didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the dark. I wanted to run, but my legs felt weak, and the air seemed to press down on me. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whine, like feedback from a microphone, coming from the device. It was off, but the sound grew louder, and soon it wasn't just a whine. It was whispers, overlapping, unintelligible, but angry. I bolted out of the lab, slamming the door behind me, and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, bouncing off the walls. By the time I reached the main hallway, they faded, but I could still feel them. It was like there was a lingering presence just beyond my perception. The next day, Richard wasn't at school. I asked around, but nobody seemed to know where he was. Some kids even said he'd moved away, but nobody could remember seeing him leave. It was like he'd vanished, apparently just like his dad. I tried to forget about that day, but I couldn't. Sometimes when it's quiet, I feel that tingling sensation again, like static on my skin. I see flashes of light in the corner of my eye, tiny specks darting through the air. And at night, when I close my eyes, I hear those whispers, faint and angry, calling me back to the basement, back to the Neutrons. I still have no idea what Richard did to me, but I think part of me is still connected to them, to that invisible, neutral world. And I'm terrified that one day, they'll pull me back in for good. In high school physics, we were learning about radioactive decay, and for some reason, neutrons were really tripping me up, especially when protons changed into neutrons, or vice versa. There was a test coming up next week, and needless to say, I wasn't prepared. My teacher, Miss Carver, was one of those no-nonsense types, short gray hair, piercing eyes, and a way of explaining things that made you feel like you were already failing. She'd been droning on about beta decay all week, and I still couldn't wrap my head around how something so small could be so complicated. After class on Friday, I stayed behind to ask for some extra help. The classroom was empty, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desks. Miss Carver looked at me over her glasses and said, "If you're serious about passing, meet me in the lab tonight at 7. I've got something that might help you understand neutrons better." Her tone was odd, almost secretive, but I was desperate, so I agreed. That night, the school certainly felt different. The hallways were dark, save for the flickering exit signs, and my footsteps echoed too loudly. When I reached the physics lab, Miss Carver was already there, standing by a table cluttered with equipment. She didn't say much. Instead, she just handed me a worksheet and pointed to a small metal box on the counter. It had a faded radiation symbol on it, and next to it was something that looked like an old voltmeter, its needle twitching slightly. "This," she said, "is a neutron source." Her voice was flat and cold. "We use it to demonstrate how neutrons interact with matter. Sit here and take some readings while you work through those problems. It'll make the concept stick." I sat down, a little uneasy. The box was cold to the touch when I adjusted it as she instructed, and I swear I felt a faint vibration, like a heartbeat. Miss Carver watched me for a minute, then said she had to grab something from her office. "Don't touch anything else," she warned, before leaving me alone. The lab was dead quiet, except for that box. As I scribbled answers, I started hearing a low hum, so faint I thought it was my imagination. Then the voltmeter needle jumped, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I glanced around, but the room was empty. Just me, the equipment, and that humming, which was getting louder and more like a pulse. I tried my best to focus on the worksheet, but my hands were shaking. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving along the wall. It wasn't mine, and the light was behind me. When I turned, it was gone. This is where my heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just stress. Lack of sleep, maybe. Anything but what my gut was screaming. Then the humming turned into a rhythmic thudding, like something heavy was shifting inside the metal box. I stood up, ready to bolt, when I saw it again, the shadow. This time it lingered, stretching across the floor like a puddle of ink. It didn't have a clear shape, but it moved, sliding towards me. I backed up, knocking over a stool, and that's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't words, just a low, raspy sound, like static mixed with breathing. It came from the direction of the neutron source. Now my eyes were locked onto the box, and I swear the air around it shimmered like heat rising off pavement. The shadow on the floor pulsed in time with the thudding, and I felt this overwhelming dread. It was like something was watching me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I grabbed my bag and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but it was like the frame was sealed shut. Panic set in, and I pounded on the glass, yelling for Miss Carver. All the while, the whispering grew louder, and I felt a cold pressure on my back, like invisible hands pushing me toward the table. I spun around, and the shadow was right there, inches away, towering over me. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its presence, heavy, suffocating, and impossibly old. The lights flickered, and the thudding stopped. For a split second, everything was silent. Then the door flew open, and Miss Carver stormed in, her face pale. "What did you do?" she snapped, rushing to the neutron source. She slammed a switch on the wall I hadn't noticed before, and the humming died out. The shadow also vanished, and the pressure lifted, leaving me gasping on the floor. She didn't explain much. Instead, she just muttered something about calibration errors and told me to go home. But as I stumbled out of the lab, I saw her shove a notebook into a drawer, her hands trembling. I didn't stick around to ask questions. The next day, I couldn't shake what had happened. I started digging online, looking up neutron sources and their effects. Most of it was boring physics stuff, but then I found an article about how neutrons can penetrate matter, walls, skin, anything, without leaving a trace. There were mentions of radiation exposure causing hallucinations, but nothing about shadows or whispers. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if that box was more than just a teaching tool. Monday came, and Miss Carver acted like nothing happened. She handed out the test, and I somehow aced it. Every answer about neutrons came to me like I'd known it all along. But that night, the nightmares started. I'd wake up hearing that thudding, feeling that cold pressure, seeing shadows that didn't belong. Once, I caught my reflection in the mirror, and for a second my eyes glowed, like they were reflecting something that wasn't there. Weeks later, I overheard a janitor talking about how the lab was closed off for equipment upgrades. Miss Carver disappeared after that, quit without notice, they said. I tried my best to forget it and move on, but even now, years later, I can't walk into a quiet room without listening for that hum. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel it, a faint pulse deep in my bones, like something still passing through me, silent and unseen. I took an algorithms class as an undergrad, and though the material was rather dense, our teacher Dr. Marber was pretty chill. For the final project, it was rather open-ended, but Dr. Marber actually did a good job making sure we didn't slack off. We had to propose ideas for a coding project, and I decided to simulate a nuclear reactor. Don't ask me how I thought of it just seemed kind of cool, and like it wouldn't actually be that much work. But fast forward to 3 days before the project was due, and I realized I was in over my head. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I was alone in the university's computer lab, with the only light coming from the flickering glow of my laptop screen. The lab was a sterile, windowless room in the basement of the science building, surrounded by concrete walls that seemed to swallow sound. I'd been running on coffee and adrenaline for days, trying to get this nuclear reactor simulation to work. My code was supposed to model neutron interactions within a reactor core, pretty basic stuff, or so I thought. But every time I ran it, the program crashed, spitting out error messages I didn't understand. I rubbed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, the hum of the air vents overhead filling the silence. "Come on," I muttered, "just one successful run." I tweaked a few lines of code, something about the neutron flux calculations, and hit execute. The screen froze for a second, then it lit up with a cascade of data. Numbers scrolled faster than I could read, and a 3D visualization of the reactor core popped up, neutrons darting around like fireflies. "Yes," I whispered, pumping my fist. It was working. But then, something weird happened. The visualization started to glitch. The neutrons weren't moving randomly anymore. They were forming patterns, swirling into tight, unnatural spirals. I frowned and tapped the keyboard, thinking it was a rendering bug. That's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat, coming from my laptop speakers. I yanked my headphones off, but the sound didn't stop. It was echoing through the lab now, pulsing in time with the spirals on the screen. I was starting to get extremely freaked out. I glanced around, my skin prickling. The lab was still empty, but the air felt heavier, like someone, or something, was watching me. It's just the vents, I told myself, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the concrete walls. I turned back to my laptop, and that's when I saw the numbers on the neutron counter spike. Not in the simulation, in the actual lab. The radiation detectors mounted on the wall, the ones that were always dormant unless an experiment was running, were blinking red, their faint beeps cutting through the thudding noise. What the hell? I stood up so fast my chair tipped over, clattering against the floor. The detectors shouldn't have been active. The university had an experimental neutron source 2 floors down used for physics research, but it was locked up tight and monitored 24/7. There was no way my simulation could... My stomach dropped. I'd connected to the lab's network to pull some sample data earlier that night. Had I accidentally linked my code to the real system? No, that was impossible. I was just tired and imagining things. I reached for the power button to shut down my laptop, but before I could press it, the screen flickered again, and the neutron pattern shifted into something new. It looked like words. "We see you." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thudding sound grew louder and faster, and now there was a faint whispering layered beneath it, hundreds of voices murmuring words I couldn't make out. The lights in the lab flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, as the radiation detector's beeps turned into a shrill alarm. This didn't seem like a glitch. My simulation had tapped into something real, something dangerous. I lunged for the control panel near the door, where the lab's safety systems were wired. The neutron source status was flashing, active, flux unstable. That meant neutrons were escaping containment downstairs, bombarding the building with radiation. If it kept escalating, it could trigger a meltdown, or worse. I tried to initiate the shutdown sequence, but the panel locked me out, overridden by an external command. It was my code. It was controlling everything now. I ran back to my laptop, hands shaking, and tried to kill the program. The keyboard didn't respond. Instead, the screen pulsed, the words changing, "You can't stop us." The whispering grew clearer, forming a single phrase repeated over and over, "Too many, too many, too many." I realized with a sickening jolt that it was talking about the neutrons. My simulation had miscalculated their behavior, amplifying them somehow, and now they were multiplying out of control in the real neutron source. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to call campus security, but the signal was dead. The lab's thick walls blocked everything. I was trapped, alone, and with the disaster I'd created. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a split second, and when they came back on, the air smelled faintly of ozone, like something was burning. That's when I remembered Elon Musk. Yes, Elon Musk. I'd seen him tweet about coding and physics before, and he was some kind of genius with reactors and rockets, right? It was a long shot, insane even, but I was out of options. I opened X, hands trembling so badly I could barely type, and sent him a DM. "Please help, my nuclear simulation is out of control, real neutron source unstable, university lab, I'm begging you." I didn't expect a reply. Why would he even see it? But less than a minute later, my phone buzzed. It had a message, coordinates, now. I sent him the lab's location, my mind racing, then another buzz, video call me. I hit the call button, and there he was, Elon Musk, his face lit by the glow of a screen, looking dead serious. "Show me," he said, voice calm but urgent. I flipped the camera to my laptop, the neutron patterns now writhing like a living thing, then panned to the blaring detectors and locked control panel. "All right," he said, squinting. "You've got a rogue process interfacing with the hardware. First, unplug your laptop." I tried. It won't shut off. It's running on its own. Musk didn't flinch. And we sever the connection manually. The neutron source, is it networked? Yeah, through the lab system. Find the main router. Should be a box with blinking lights near the panel. Yank the Ethernet cable. I bolted to the corner of the room, spotting the router tucked behind a stack of manuals. The whispering was deafening now, the air thick with static. I ripped the cable out and the thudding stopped, but the simulation kept running and the detectors kept screaming. "It's not working," I yelled into the phone. Musk cursed under his breath. "Okay, plan B. The neutron source has a physical kill switch, redundancy for emergencies. Look for a red lever near the control panel, probably behind a cover." I scanned the wall, spotting a small metal plate. I pried it open with my nails, revealing a dusty red lever. Got it. "Pull it hard," he said, "and brace yourself." I yanked the lever down with all my strength. A loud clunk echoed through the lab, followed by a hiss as the neutron source powered down. The detectors fell silent. My laptop screen went black, finally dead. The whispering also stopped, leaving only the hum of the vents. I sank to the floor, clutching my phone. It's over," I gasped. "Good," Musk said. "Now rewrite that code before you run it again. Simulations like that need guardrails, lots of them. He paused, then added, "You're lucky I was up working on Starship." Then the call ended. I sat there in the quiet, the weight of what almost happened sinking in. 3 days later, I turned to my project, debugged, simplified, and safe. Dr. Marber even gave me an A, oblivious to the nightmare I lived through. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint thudding in my head, a reminder of the neutrons I unleashed, and the man who helped me cage them again.